right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Eric Paley. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So Eric Paley is the co-founder of Founder Collective, which is one of the first seed firms, which is a concept that didn't always exist. And when they started, there was a few of them. It later became popular to be what's now called founder friendly. But Founder Collective was one of the early ones to kind of seek alignment with the founder, as opposed to replacing the founder as quickly as you can. Big success as a firm, right? Uber, Cruise, Airtable, Trade Desk, a number of big hits. But before that, you were a founder yourself and founded Abstract Edge and Brontes, a couple different companies. I guess I'll start out. Why is it a collective? That's a pretty collective is a pretty specific word and evokes a pretty specific thing.
Yeah, I think we were trying to, it's actually hard to remember a world now where seed basically didn't exist. VCs were really finance people. There's still a lot of finance people in VC, but most VCs were finance people and they thought like finance people. I mean, they really were sort of wolves in sheep's clothing. Still, again, there's many folks who are like that today, but that was
Right.
basically most of the industry. And as entrepreneurs, we had experienced a lot of that in ways that were really negative, and did not want to be a fund anything like that. And so we started off, with two of us full time and a collective, I think it was eight at the time, what we called founder partners, all of whom had also been founders and were running their companies day to day. And then what we realized over time is if we did it right, our founders who we invested in could also be part of that collective because they could be adding a lot of value for each other in the body of knowledge that they create. And we found a whole bunch of ways to execute on that I think has really made it a broader and broader collective over time.
Yeah. So what is the difference? Well, let me ask you this. What percentage, almost every VC is sort of like, ends up hating themselves as a founder, right? Like I worked at, Google and somebody founded that. So technically I'm a founder, or, I founded a venture capital firm. But of people who really founded companies and went through the thing, the pain and the raising money and all that, how common is that in venture? Like, what do you think the real percentage is of those types of people?
But luckily, it's gone up a lot. And we can
Yeah.
talk about, does it really make a better investor? I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there. What I think it makes better is that's who I'd want to work with
Yeah.
because they understand, if as a founder, because they understand what I've been going through. And when I don't agree with them, and there's some kind of disagreement about what to do, at least I know it's not hypothetical, right? It's somebody who's actually done this before giving me feedback that's different from the way I'm thinking about it. But the numbers have definitely gone up. One of the things that I find very insincere is when founders talk about when VCs talk about founding their firms as being a founder.
Right.
It's so fundamentally different. And there's only one part of it that's similar, which is fundraising.
Right. Right.
And then it is actually very hard to fundraise the first time for a venture firm, or if you're dramatically increasing the size of a fund, it can be very challenging. In some ways, it's even harder than being an entrepreneur, fundraising for a venture-backed startup, because there's no way to really create FOMO. You literally can, every LP knows you can accommodate 24 LPs.
Yes.
So until something's happening, there's not a lot of reason for anyone to act. Whereas for an entrepreneur, there's usually one lead. So that's like the one thing that's harder. After that, it is the least results-driven business you could ever imagine, whereas founders are on the line for driving results every single day. So, you create a culture and you do some marketing, and there are things that look like starting a company, but it really is, diminishes how much harder it really is to start a venture-backed startup.
Yeah.
And how different the experience is. And it's sort of a neat way for VCs to be like, see, I'm like you.
Yeah.
But I think any real founders probably hearing that and being like, oh yeah, right. Okay. You
Right.
Little league, and here I am in the majors trying to, hit really, 100-mile-per-hour fastballs.
Yeah. Well, and as I tell people, you really shouldn't start a company. It's a really bad idea. And, when people come to say, oh, I have this idea, should I start a company? My answer is always like, no, you should not start a company. And if they say, well, screw you, I'm going to start it anyway, you're like, okay, well, then you should start a company.
Yeah.
But the guy,
I joke
you
about
know,
it too, like the risk adjusted return on any startup at the beginning is zero, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's the math, right? And the only reason to do it is not because you think you're going to get rich doing it, but because you feel so compelled to go do that thing and you're
yeah,
so willing to take on the challenge of it because you're just feeling that level of drive about it, right?
yeah.
Not because, there's going to be a pot of gold at the end of that. There almost definitely is not going to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's a crazy thing. We look out, 30 companies, I guess, in our first portfolio. And, every day there's something, like something, oh man, you kind of feel it. Like that guy's, CTO just quit and they're running out of money, or, oh, wow, that guy got a term. This is great. And but you're sitting there watching it a little more like a TV show, maybe. But you kind of have to remember that, boy, when you're in it, oh, the news that your CTO quit, or you got 6 weeks and your staff needs to know, and like all those things are human experiences going on. But there's 30 of them, so you're kind of, it's not that you don't care, but they don't hit you. Each one doesn't hit you as hard as when you're in the thing.
And you don't really own it at the end of the day. It's a portfolio and you're not the decision maker. There are situations where unfortunately you have to be, but very rare situations. So you're an advisor, right? And
Yeah,
it's so much easier. It doesn't mean as an advisor, it doesn't mean, or an investor, it doesn't mean you don't want to see the company be wildly successful. But the pressure of actually owning the decision that may make or break the business is
yeah,
so different, right? And one of the things I think we forget a lot as VCs is we'll often be very flip. Like we'll see a resume and be like, yeah, hire that person.
yeah.
Or, oh, that person's giving you a hard time, just fire them.
Right.
And without actually understanding how complicated that decision is, how many trade-offs there are involved. Because it's easy to say, yeah, just fire that person. But actually, if they're difficult, but they're actually getting a lot done for the company, it might take you 6 months to find somebody who can replace that, or you might hire somebody else to replace them who's far worse, and it takes you 18 months to get back where you were by
Right.
finding the right person. So all of that is the weight of owning the outcome of every one of these decisions, rather than, unfortunately, when you're running a portfolio, it can be very easy to be lazy in
Yeah.
understanding the magnitude of each choice.
Yeah. What do you think, having been an entrepreneur, now that we've established what that actually means, what do you think it helps you with as a venture capitalist? I mean, is it that, when you're sitting across from somebody, you're like, okay, this person, great person, doesn't have what it takes to get through it? Or is it that once you've invested, you can, you know, understand what they're talking about in a little more than maybe, nothing wrong with investment bankers, but maybe, someone who worked in investment banking their whole life?
So I think there's two things. One, there's definitely the empathy part of it that I think a lot of founders need just to feel supported. That this is hard and they're going through it, and you know how hard it is. That counts for a lot, because it's very easy to sit in the cheap seats and think it's easy to do, having never done it before.
Right.
Oh, it's just all they have to do is this, and if they do that and do that, the company would be a success. And I don't know why the CEO is not doing that, right?
Right.
That's one category. But the one I would really focus on that I think people lose sight of is VCs live at 30,000 feet. They do not see any of the detail, right? They do not understand what happens on the ground. And they tend to look at outcomes and pattern match about against them without actually understanding how any of those companies got there. So,
Right.
we often say this to founders, like, your VC wants you to be $1 billion business, and they want you to jump over every other part of building the business as if none of the other stuff ever mattered, so that you'll become $1 billion business. But you
Right.
can't become $1 billion business without being a $10 million business.
Yeah.
You actually have to do that stuff.
Right.
You're not going to birth it as $1 billion business. But
Right.
from the VC standpoint, they kind of not only wish you would, but very little respect for what has to happen to get there.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of the VCs don't want it. It's like, nah, 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 nah. I don't even want to hear it.
Right.
Right. Like, don't get me involved. One of my VCs said to me, you involved us too much in the sausage making when he was on my board. And
Interesting.
I resented that comment. I was like, geez, you sold me that you were here to help me. And
Yeah.
I was totally transparent with you about the challenges I was facing. Not only were you not particularly helpful, but then you complained that I
Yeah.
showed you what I had to go through to get to this place.
Yeah.
Right. But that's part of the deal, right? That is part of why the person on the ground has so much real work to do. And it's very easy to minimize that and think it doesn't matter. Another example is, I think it almost never happens that companies birth a platform, but VCs love that idea. they want companies to be platforms from day one. Well, if you try to be a platform from day one, you probably will never get anything working whatsoever.
Right.
It's very easy for a VC to look at things from 30,000 feet and be like, well, this company is wildly successful, they're a platform. This company is wildly successful, they're a platform. And not understand that at the beginning, none of those companies were platforms. They built
Right.
applications. And
Right.
those applications gave them license because they were successful to become platforms. Right.
Right.
But from the VC standpoint, there's something powerful about beginning with the end in mind. But if you don't understand the steps to get to the end, it is very dangerous. And that is typically a big problem. VCs push entrepreneurs to skip over validation because they just
Right.
want to get to the end point. When you skip over validation, usually you screw up your entire business. But
Yeah.
that's like a slow motion train wreck that the VC doesn't even appreciate or understand because they want the company birthed as $1 billion company.
Right. And so how does an entrepreneur tell the story? Because everybody knows all this now, like in retrospect. But of course, it's the classic Warren Buffett thing, right? He tells you how to get rich. You just have to actually do it. Not panic when everyone else does. How do you tell the story where Uber comes along and everyone's like, well, it's just a black car service, small, right? I mean, I think the Pez dispenser eBay thing might be a little apocryphal, but hey, I've got a Pez dispenser company, small, right? But
Yep.
of course, in hindsight, you understand that that's the passionate group that starts the thing that ends up being the platform. But here we are today with just our little black car company. Like, how should an entrepreneur tell that story to a VC?
I think one of the biggest challenges in our industry is VCs say they invest in markets ahead of everything else. But I think VCs are terrible at understanding markets and really bad at market sizing. So even when Uber was already a huge business, there were people writing about how it could never be a really big business,
Right.
right? Like still, and there were numerous people I talked to Uber about VCs that I spoke to Uber about in the early days, and they'd say, I don't get it. Like, how hard is it to create a mobile app for one of the 10,000, 50,000 livery companies in the US? Like, they'll all do that. Like,
Right.
what is special about this? And we believe there was the potential for a network effect. Didn't mean we were going to be right about that. We were wrong about a lot of things. But largely the way we do it more than anything else is we follow the entrepreneur. So we're interested in an entrepreneur who's way out ahead of us in understanding, not just envisioning, but testing and learning in the market about what's going to happen. So interestingly, everyone thinks that Travis Kalanick pitched me on Uber, and I did have lots of interesting interactions with Travis, but it was Ryan Graves who pitched me on Uber,
Huh.
who was running the company at the time, and he had multiple cars already on the road, and his observations about what was happening and what he thought was going to happen in the market with this approach and what was different about it and significant, he led us to an understanding that didn't mean we were going to be right, but allowed us to appreciate his vision and the work he was doing, maybe Travis and Garrett's vision, but the collective vision and the
Right.
work they were doing to validate it that made it seem more and more real. And the thing we get very obsessed with is the people who do that work well, we think are going to keep doing that work well, and they'll
Mhm.
find their way to success. And the people who just want to talk about the vision, but don't really want to engage the hard parts and really talk about the work, they're going to do that forever. And when the company's not working, they're just going to keep waving their hands with stories of vision.
Yeah.
Right. So there's something about the people who really love to test it in the real world and learn from the real world and adapt. Like you could say to Ryan at the time, tell me a couple examples of assumptions you guys had that haven't played out the way you thought they would. And he would give you great examples of how, in the few months they had been doing this, they learned things that immediately got them to change what they were doing.
Right.
And again, that's the type of dynamic thinking that we're really looking for.
Right.
So, ultimately, yes, we believe the market could be big, but it was much more about believing in the person that was leading the charge to find the way.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, the social network thing too, when that happened. I mean, aside from everybody saying nobody's ever going to put their photo online, and that was a common thing that people were saying at the time, it was kind of like, well, the market's, there's 4 million people, right? That go to college in the United States. So maybe you get a 3 million person market, which, I don't know how many tens of X's that's off by, but, and I think one of the things I felt about when Uber and, Lyft as well emerged, the first time I was like, oh, crap, this is something. I got in like I guess it was a lift, and the woman driving. I was like, what's the deal here? And she's like, oh, I'm driving this thing, and I'm paying for my tuition at like San Francisco State with it. And then you go, oh, okay. What's happening here? And this is what happened, I guess, with eBay. People are like, hey, I'm making a living on this thing. Airbnb, when you've got other entrepreneurs, she's has her own little business driving a car to pay for school. Then you go, if she's doing this to change her life to go to school, you can find another billion people somewhere. Like I don't know where, but it's the tiny story. It's just that one story, like that one person doing one thing, and you're like, yeah, but that makes sense. As opposed to, well, I'm going to tell you theoretically how we're going to change your enterprise by this and that, and it's theoretical. I don't know. It's something about that story in the moment. You're like, oh,
Absolutely. Those anecdotes that you look at and say, well, there's got to be a lot of this. And I'll even give you an earlier one with Uber, because UberX obviously came later. The original, which became known as Uber Black, but was just Uber Cab at the time, was livery drivers. And a typical livery driver would get pre-scheduled for the day for their car and was very expensive, right?
yeah,
For the ride. And like Boston Coach was like this big livery agency. And they might have 3 drives the entire day and tons of downtime between them because it just was so fragmented. And they had to make a living off them, which is why it was so expensive. So very early on, and one of the things Ryan was able to help us understand is there was so much invisible inventory, right? These people had hours a day in which at a lower price, they'd be happy to grab a ride on demand,
right,
right? And because they knew they didn't have to go to their next ride for 3 hours, right? But they happen to be in the area.
yeah,
And you look at that invisible inventory, and yeah, I wasn't sitting there going, okay, what's the math of sizing it? You just look and you're like, there are a lot of those people. And there are a lot of people who would happily take a ride from someone like that, a professional driver, at like half the cost of what it would have cost if I pre-booked that driver.
yeah,
And so from minute one, they were attacking an angle of the market that you could start engaging those types of anecdotes and extrapolate and go, yeah, like there's something pretty interesting there.
yeah, yeah. And tell me about following the entrepreneur. People always ask us, well, what's your, what things do you invest in? Like they want to hear cybersecurity and like a list of things. And our answer is generally like, well, I mean, we're very focused. We're focused on software. We invest at the seed stage, which is the earliest stage. But we let the entrepreneur tell us the future, because wouldn't the best entrepreneurs figure this? Like, I don't. So I guess what I'm getting at is we've seen an emergence of a lot of thesis focused funds where the VC has the idea first, right? We're like, whoa, the future is, I don't know, the financial system as applied to mobility, or some idea that the VC starts with, which seems to me the kind of the wrong way to do this. If you're, because then our entrepreneur is going to come sell you that your story that you want to hear, and they're not going to be natural fits for it. It's been an interesting phenomenon because 20 years ago, nobody, not Kleiner, not Sequoia, not anybody had that idea. Like, oh, we're just going to focus on this, our idea first.
I don't know if that's true 20 years ago. VCs had a lot of self-confidence 20 years ago that they knew if you pitched a VC and they didn't invest in you, people still use this term, right? This very glib term, I passed.
Yeah.
But embedded in that term is this notion that, like, I know what a good company is and a bad company is. And if I invested, it's a good company. And if I didn't invest, it's a bad company. And that's just not true, right? Like, that's like being a baseball hitter and saying, I know what a good pitch is and a bad pitch is. And if I hit it out of the park, it was a good pitch for, and
Yeah.
if I didn't swing it, it was a bad pitch. But sometimes you don't swing at a strike in yours because it's not the part of the zone that you hit well in. Right.
Right.
And I think the reality is there are so many companies. We've been very lucky. We've had an incredible portfolio, could not ask for more, but there have been so many companies we missed because it wasn't the right opportunity for us to appreciate the entrepreneur at that stage.
Right.
Right. And that's tough to believe, but we are not a binary system of we're right or we're wrong. And so I go back to VCs were quite arrogant in those days, but let's dig in from there to this idea of the VC coming up with the idea. I think there's nothing more cheap in the venture industry or in entrepreneurship than ideas, right? I think it really comes down to execution and the craft of the execution. craft of execution goes well beyond an idea. It's a million ideas. It's every little angle of figuring out how do you make whatever it is you're delivering special for your customer.
Right.
And that's not like a singular idea. That whole thing is a myth, right? That there's some, now you need to start with some kind of idea. Usually you start with, the best entrepreneurs, I think, start with a problem they want to solve, and then they are very adaptable to what would be a great solution for that problem. But something's got to motivate you to spend it. We talked about this before, to spend all your time pursuing something when the risk adjusted value of it is zero, right? And so you got to get motivated, and that idea might be the thing that motivates you. But I think that's taken on a life of its own. And VCs want to seem really smart. And the way they like to feel smart is they like to be analysts of markets, and they want to believe they're in the prognostication business, that they are the ones who can evaluate ideas and predict the future. And I don't actually think successful VCs do that, or maybe very few do, and we're just not good at it, but there are some people who are really good at that.
Yeah.
I don't buy that, right? I don't think that is, I actually think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people become very bad VCs, is because they think that they know what the future is going to bring, and that's their job, is to like go predict the future. Right. And then they find people to bet on who like align to their prediction of the future, but those aren't the right people to invest in, right?
Right.
And so we get away from this idea myth. We even recognize that many of the things that will become great companies may not obviously seem like great ideas when you first engage them. But we're looking for the entrepreneur to help us understand the work they're doing and the craft, and why they believe, and what the craft is teaching them about the space, or if you want to call it the idea they're going after. And then we start really engaging that thought process to figure out, are they all over it? Are they many steps ahead of us? Are they engaging the really hard parts of it? And can you believe that they might be right?
Yep.
Right. And what we say is that helps us pursue what we call the weird and wonderful, right? Because I think thesis-driven investing forces everyone into clusters of hype, right? And we did this analysis where we looked at 20 years of what the highest hype thing was in the year, the theme that was the most hyped in that year, and then what was the most valuable company created that year. And in 20 years of the last 20 years, never has the most valuable company fit the hyped thesis of that moment.
Yep.
If you look at it a little more closely, what you see is there's like a 4 to 7 year lag of when the companies are created that end up 4 to 7 years later, the theme emerges, right? So Uber gets created in 2010, and by 2014, everyone's talking about the sharing economy, right? And by the way, Airbnb predates that. And yet, if you do look up Google terms, the sharing economy didn't exist as a term until, I can look at it, 2014, 15. And even right now, it's not to say that AI is not really important software tooling. We believe in it. But the company that inspired this moment of AI is OpenAI. And that was founded, I think, in 2017.
Right.
So that's a 7-year lag from when the company was founded. Now, that doesn't mean there's not great opportunities in AI, but I would go as far as saying that the company that becomes most valuable 10 years from now, from 2024, likely will not be an AI first company. It will probably utilize AI tools, but in the way we think about AI, right? The company, the theme the year Uber was born was SoLo-Mo.
Right.
Social, local, mobile.
Mobile, yeah.
Well, 2 of those things were true in Uber.
Yeah.
But the company that was most sexy at that time in the theme was Foursquare.
Yeah.
What happened to Foursquare? Yeah. It still exists, but like that's not nobody thinks of that as one of the great emerging companies at the time.
Yeah.
Uber hit on some of those things, but nobody thought of it as a SoLo-Mo company in that period of time.
Right.
Right. So anyway, this is how we think about it. And I think if you ask, why does VC look so lemming-like? This is one of the core drivers, is there's no point in pursuing a theme that no entrepreneurs are working on. Right. And there's no reason for entrepreneurs to work on something. I don't want to say no reason, but most entrepreneurs want to work on things that people want to fund. So you get this cycle of clustering constantly.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great example. Foursquare, which I sense is the phase we're in now, where people are like, okay, there's a new technology, and they squeeze their little brain and they go, what would you do with it? And you come up with check-ins. That's what you do with it. You check into places and you become mayor. And then you get somebody like Travis, or however the story ends up going, who says, no, that's not what you do with a mobile phone that can locate you and take a credit card, What you do is you get a ride. But it's not, he didn't start, I don't think they started thinking from the technology side. They started thinking from the damn it, I can't get a cab in Paris side.
Exactly. They
And just,
invert it and they
yeah,
say, there's this problem that's really annoying. San Francisco, Boston, outside of New York City, maybe Washington, a few places, getting a taxi was very, very difficult. There's this problem that's really annoying. I wonder if we can do it better. And then, like, what are the tools available that might help us do it better? Oh, here are some tools. But
yeah,
it's not like, what are the tools that exist today that are exciting? What can we do with them? I'm
yeah.
not saying you could never start a company that way, but I think it is a much less natural way. And it's also where so much Me Too startup thinking happened.
Hmm. Well, and all the people who didn't understand that and started sharing economy things that didn't have the same, hey, we're going to share parking spaces, or we're going to share valets, or we're going to share maids and things like that. And it just, you didn't understand what, like, the problem they were solving. And it was just Me Too and Uber for this and Uber for that.
Yep.
What I want to ask you, as you started, when you started, there were a few seed firms, and it wasn't a thing, right? And we're in a world now where there's hundreds of seed firms. They've got every kind of brand, and then focused on AI and focused on this. But there were only a few at the time, right? Like when you started
Yeah,
it.
I mean, I think of First Round. I think of OATV,
Yeah,
Maples, which became Floodgate,
yeah,
um, Jeff Clavier, but there were a half dozen sort of nationally recognized seed firms. And then there were a whole bunch of other venture funds that were seed funds because they couldn't raise more money.
yeah.
Right. It was
Right,
like,
right.
well, I can
Yeah,
only raise $30 million, so I'm going to do
yeah,
seed investing. But it wasn't world-class people. And I'm sure I'm leaving a few out that
yeah,
really were world-class, but those are the ones at the time. And when we were starting it, I admit a bit of ignorance. We didn't think there were any. Because, like, it's like we came up with this thought of what we should do, and then we started researching. We're like, oh, there are some folks out there who are seeing the same thing that
yeah,
we're seeing, but it was so few and far between that I didn't even know they existed until
right.
we started pursuing this.
So I have this is kind of my half joke question for people who are in this golden age of, when there's just a few seed firms. Why weren't you in everything? Like, why weren't you in every? You were in more hits than 99% of VCs. Five of them. But why weren't you in every single one? Pinterest and Airbnb and Okta and all of them. If you had the whole field or most of the field to yourself.
Yeah, I think there's some myth that the entire thing is just a competitive game. I think a lot of VCs feel that way, partially because the definition, I say this mockingly, but the definition of a good deal, we don't like to use the word deal, but a good deal is how VCs think. A good deal is a deal that somebody I respect wants to do.
Yeah.
Right. That's how a deal is defined. So if I was looking at something and I wasn't that excited, but then I heard somebody else was looking at it that I think highly of, now it's a good deal. Right. Like, not independently, I judged it to be so, or I'll tell myself I did. I hope I'm using myself as an example. I hope
Right.
this is not how we do business, but I think the industry is really like that. Right.
Yeah.
And so everyone starts believing that the whole game is just this competitive game. And if it was less competitive, you could be in everything. And I think the reality is quite different than that, right? I think the game is, if it's a game, is really getting to know entrepreneurs. You rightfully should be making a real commitment to supporting them.
Yeah.
Not because, like, they threw a quick idea your way and you're like, that's a cool idea, here's some money. But you're actually spending the time to understand them and get to know them. And there's no question an index fund of 2010 in venture, if you had good judgment, could have been a very strong fund.
Yeah.
But our goal was much more to get to know these founders, pick the ones we really felt we could get behind because we understood them well enough, and then really get behind them.
Right.
Right. And I think the index funds side of it just speaks to something that's incredibly passive. And we weren't always super active in every situation, but we never wanted to be that purely passive investor. And we also never wanted to be that's a cool idea, we'll throw money into it, because we were really trying to get to know people.
Yeah.
And even though there probably were, I couldn't tell you, from 2009 to 2013, maybe 100 really great companies built, or whatever that number is,
Yeah.
there were thousands of companies to meet with.
Yeah.
Right. And every meeting is an opportunity cost. Every investment's an opportunity cost. So you're trying to constantly figure out like, where am I investing my time in getting to know people that I can really get behind and believe in.
Yeah.
And so I think it looks a little differently than the field was just wide open. It wasn't competitive. You could just do every good deal. Because the other thing I'd say is our history demonstrates that most of the very best things we invested in, they didn't look like the good deal in the moment we invested in them. They were only
Yeah.
defined by the good deal as the good deal because we liked it. Not
Yeah.
because, I mean, many of the things were passed on by a million people, and people don't know. Like Uber was passed on by many, many
Yeah.
investors. Um, so it wasn't like you could just clean up all the good stuff. But
Yeah.
again, I think a lot of angels or VCs who are writing smaller checks think of it that way because they really define the good thing as the thing that Sequoia is doing, and can they sneak some dollars into it?
Right.
So I think it's
Right.
the wrong mindset. And I think people have a funny, like when people say I won the deal in venture, I see why LPs want to know who can win the deal on some level, but I don't really think that's how you make great investments.
Yeah. And it's a different game at the seed stage versus the later stage when the winner's a little bit more apparent.
I'm a seed stage investor, so I
Yeah.
I don't have that skill, but I
Yeah.
I will tell you the number of companies that were massively financed by well-respected funds that did not work out, and I go as far as saying the financing destroyed the company.
Yeah.
Suggests that that is not as easy a game as
Yeah.
people think as well. But I think a
Well, yeah.
lot of it comes down to, what are we trying to accomplish is a question at every company. And it's a question in our industry. And I would say we don't agree on what we're trying to accomplish. VCs don't agree on what we're trying to accomplish. There's a monoculture about what that is fundamentally wrong,
Yeah.
right? And maybe they do agree, but it's the wrong thing. And it's not, sometimes very often the entrepreneur gets baited into it because the short-term incentives support that as well.
Yeah.
But then the entrepreneur ultimately gets blamed when it doesn't work the way the VC wanted, even though it was the VC and the monoculture of our industry that told people that, what we should be doing was really not the right thing.
Right. I mean, it's just kind of an incredible time you're investing in, and it's a different time now. I have one tactical thing for you, and then a couple bigger things, and we wrap up. But about the companies being overfunded, like whose fault is that? In the sense that everybody kind of knows this issue, right? A company raises too much money and they pour gasoline on a flame that doesn't exist, basically, and the company fails, and then the small company that struggles for capital and is efficient does really well. But of course, you don't have to spend the money when you do the big round, right? And eBay famously raised a bunch of money from Bob Kaggle and never touched it. So, what do you think the dynamic is? Because the experience that I've had with this is an entrepreneur, something's working, bunch of money from a big VC, and the big VC says, you need to level up. You need to hire famous guy. And you go hire famous guy, and you're the entrepreneur, you don't know. And that guy comes in and they can't do anything with less than 20 people. And then the burn rate goes crazy. And then a year later, you're like, hey, the entrepreneur's like, famous guy doesn't really build things. He was at big company and the entrepreneurs, and then the VC's on to the next thing. Like, why does this happen?
Yeah, it's because we don't agree on what we're trying to accomplish, right?
Mm.
What VCs are trying to accomplish, and they shouldn't be, but they are, is several things. The furthest one out is a good outcome, but that is not really the primary near-term thing that VCs focused on. And so they get very distracted by other things. They're trying to accomplish markups, which means the company needs to raise a lot more money, very often a lot more money than they ever should have, because it looks really good for getting the next fund done, for showing off to your partners, for maybe your IRR. But ultimately, TVPI, right, is this total value paid in, right, is sort of the metric that VCs look at. And the easiest way to juice that is to go get huge markups, right? Then you say, okay, let's back up. How do we get huge markups? Well, the easiest way to get huge markups is buy whatever revenue and growth you can, right? Because
Yep.
if you can show a lot of revenue and growth, then VCs are much more likely to mark that up because we get baited and not baited, but like start buying into silly things like there's standard multiples companies should have. And none of those things are the things that we all should be trying to accomplish, right? What we all should, and I would say the problem for the entrepreneur is in the short term, it's also aligned to them, which is they have lots of pressures on them. And one of the ways that you think as an entrepreneur you could relieve pressure is more capital, right?
Yeah.
It feels easier. If you're working with 4 engineers and you can get to 7, you feel like you'll get features out that much faster, right?
Yeah.
If you got 6 salespeople, if only you had 10,
Yeah.
like you're going to hit your revenue goals way faster. But these are complicated organisms, and you can't just focus only on what ultimately are vanity metrics. They're vanity because at the end of the day, you have to focus on intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is what is really happening inside your business that drives the long-term value of your business and sustainability of that business.
Yeah.
Right now, some of that's economic. It's easiest to explain and understand economically, but it's not always economic, right? The intrinsic value of Facebook was growing exponentially without monetization for a long time because the engagement was so high and the virality was so high.
Yeah.
So there are other ways, or cruise automation, right? We were very lucky to be part of that. And they've had a roller coaster since, but the intrinsic value was clearly very real because they accelerated a technological area that GM had already poured billions of dollars into and was behind where Cruise had been with, I don't even know, not even $100 million. Right. And so there's tons of, but you have to really focus on that intrinsic value piece. And the problem is a lot of the vanity metrics are inconsistent with creating intrinsic value. If you spend $30 million in a year to grow your business by 10,
Right.
it is probably the case. I don't want to say there's never a scenario where it would make sense, but it is probably the case you are damaging intrinsic value, right?
Yeah.
And the way I try to explain this best of all is the capital has no insights. All it does is it is a compounder of the formula you have. So if you have a positive value formula where you're creating intrinsic value, you can start to scale that formula. So that can create great value. But if you have a negative value formula, which is usually the case in venture capital, because VCs like to skip over the ground level of solving problems,
Right.
they want to go to scale. And they want to skip over experimentation and validation because they want to go to scale, right?
Yeah.
Burn the bridges, go big or go home. But
Yeah.
it doesn't really work that way.
Right.
And so you start to try to scale things that you have negative value formulas on the hope that you'll figure out how to get it to positive value.
Right.
The problem is both for the positive value formula and the negative value formula, there is always diminishing return, constantly diminishing return.
Right.
And we can talk about all the reasons there's diminishing returns, but there's always diminishing returns. I'll give the most simple example of it. If you're hoping that your average sales rep will produce $500,000 in revenue and you kind of need them there for the math to work, and they're producing $400,000 in revenue, and your solution to that problem is adding more sales reps.
Right.
So now you've got unproductive sales reps, and now you're going to add more. It is unlikely the next set of sales reps are going to even do as well as the last set. Why? They're going to get less training. The model already doesn't work. You're now distributing your marketing leads across more sales reps. So you have this diminishing return curve. The problem for the positive value formula is as it diminishes, people still want to scale. And if you haven't found a new S curve to drive that formula, you're going to start compounding negative value.
Yeah.
Problem with the negative value formula is whether you realize it or not, and whether it takes a long time or not, or you raise 3 more very vanity-driven rounds of venture capital, you will compound the value to 0. And then everyone's going to say the same thing at the end, which is, well, the product was bad.
Yeah.
It's too simplistic. It's not that the product was bad.
Right.
It operationalizes the business well, right?
Yeah.
And sure, better product, you can always say that, right? A better product for sure would have had a better formula, but it's just too simple, right? And I think the challenge is VCs don't want to engage this discussion. But the last thing I'll add to this conversation on this topic is every time you invest in vanity and keep upselling vanity, it causes irreparable harm because it only gets harder and harder to change that, right? It's the huge layoff you'd have to do. It's the coming to your board and saying, remember that big vision I told you 6 months ago?
Yeah.
We're not going to get there. And it is easier just to accelerate the burn, trying to make the vanity stuff look right, which only makes the problem worse than it is to step back and be like, this isn't working the way we want, even though it kind of looks like it is.
Yeah.
It's not. And until it is, I can't keep accelerating like this. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
But that's the problem is nobody wants to have that conversation. And we don't ultimately agree on what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
right? Which is, are we trying to accomplish big up rounds that look really good and everyone can celebrate and the entrepreneur gets as much capital as they possibly can? Or are we really looking for great return on investment and really great intrinsic value? And if you want me to go into any more depth,
Yeah.
I think the Trade Desk is a poster child of the kind of venture-backed startups we should be creating, and their competitive set are poster children of how VCs ruin startups, because the Trade Desk raised $7 million and it's worth today just short of 50 billion,
Right.
right? And their competitors raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and none of them are in business today.
Yeah. And is it that Trade Desk just had to figure it the hell out because they couldn't spend their way out of it, and they
Some of it's the discipline, but well, it's all discipline. But the biggest thing I'll say is, if you don't have that kind of money driving you to do silly things, you just focus on intrinsic value all day
right,
long.
right,
And that money, and I could give you lots of details as how that money drove the competitive set to do things that were damaging of intrinsic value.
hmm
And the Trade Desk just kept plowing it into building intrinsic value. I'm not talking about profitability. They were very profitable very early. It does not need to be profitability. I'm an investor. I believe in investing in returns. So I'd way rather see a company investing whatever negative 20% EBITDA for 100% growth year after year than be
right,
profitable and grow half as much,
right,
right? But you have to actually see intrinsic value creation on those investments. And I would say, I don't know the number, 95% of the venture capital industry doesn't.
yeah,
It's just a house of cards of vanity, because it's a game that everyone is playing together because they don't actually understand what ultimately creates value.
yeah. It's a very weird business, venture capital. The wrapping up on a couple things. Kind of your sense of the market and your partnership. What do you make, from that time when you and a few other folks, Mike Maples, were inventing, I guess you'd call it, a seed firm, to today? What do you make of kind of what's going on? I mean, the politicization of, like, guys like Gary Tan and David Sachs having these sort of big opinions, and people all over the world listening to their venture capital podcast, but hearing about sort of political topics. And what do you make of what's kind of this whole thing has become?
I mean, I think there's two things, right? The more you can create a platform for yourself, the more people think of you.
Yeah.
And sometimes being more outrageous helps you create more of a platform. And
Mm.
so while we do a lot of content, we really try not to make it vanity, right? I mean, it gets back to the same thing. Like, we want it to be substance, right?
Yeah.
And we're really trying, to the extent people are going to think of us, it's going to be because we're collaborators, deep thinkers, sincere. I think USV has done a brilliant job of this in a very legit way.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, you can get a lot of attention by being outrageous
Yeah.
and being dramatic and extreme. And so that's one piece going on. The other piece going on is, for a lot of folks, venture is just part of their game, and they're very interested in their influence well
Yeah.
beyond venture. That is, venture was help them build a platform that allows them to self-aggrandize and
Yeah.
also politically influence.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I mean, I may not agree with everybody on the things they're trying to do, but
Yeah.
that's, they're entitled to kind of use the platform they built however they want to.
Yeah.
I think, like, that's their absolutely their right. I'm not sure it's healthy for the venture ecosystem, because I think you
Right.
see more and more people trying to replicate that. And we used to criticize, not FC, but our industry used to be critical of entrepreneurs who, like, angel invested, because they're like, you should be focused on your business. Why are you distracted? And then
Yeah.
I think everyone kind of calmed down on that and saw there were certain advantages to that and there were positives. But I think it's fair to say, if you're an LP, it's pretty legit to look at some of these situations and say, well, boy, these folks seem very distracted.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the other side of it is, maybe it creates more and more opportunities because people think of them first,
Yeah.
right? But I'll just go back to, at the end of the day, we have been able to build something very special by really trying to avoid the vanity game. And we
Right.
try to teach our entrepreneurs, or work with our entrepreneurs, or, by the way, seek entrepreneurs who also want to build substance. Because at the end of the day, it comes back to, what's the intrinsic value
Yeah.
formula there, right? And cult of personality stuff, generally speaking, is vanity.
Yeah. Well,
I
I'll finish with.
can't
Oh,
think of
go ahead.
anyone more vain than the cult of personality who's
Right.
hoping to get back into the White House, right? But
Right.
it's not, there isn't a lot of substance that goes with that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's really sort of any kind of true integrity around what's trying to be accomplished. It's cult of personality, vanity,
Yeah.
and I don't personally, at the end of the day, I don't have a very high respect for that.
Yeah. Well, let me finish with this kind of what you're looking toward. I had Hunter and Satya, who I think are guys in Silicon Valley. You can just say their names. You know what I'm talking about, the homebrew founders who love kind of working together and what they do so much that as they've just become enormously successful and don't even have LPs in their next fund, they're going to continue working together. What do you've achieved so much success. I mean, any one of these is a massive hit. And your partnership's really important to you, right? Is it Dave Franco who's your partner and you guys have worked together?
And Micah Rosenblum, who founded Brontis with me back in 2002, and,
Right.
and Commander Herson, who we know also for over a decade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a ridiculous, a lot of times an entrepreneur has a massive success and sometimes they do it again, but not usually. They're kind of done. You've accomplished so much. What do you look forward to now? Like, is it getting another trade desk and another Uber, or is it
I
what
want
animates you into
founders,
the future?
I want founders to know, and not every founder is going to appreciate this, or sometimes when we push back, it's annoying. But I want founders to know that there is a fund that's out there that wants them to build with substance and wants to always deliver on substance, right? That is aligned in that goal. And I think there are people in our industry who do that well. I'm not sure how many funds do that really well,
Mhm.
right? So I think we are offering something pretty differentiated still, despite there now being hundreds of seed funds. I think there is uh, a really important place for our message and our product in the industry. We shared some of the places where we were thinking about, I don't know if you want to call it compromising or expanding, or
Yeah.
ultimately we decide constantly not to do these things. But there is always this, like when things were going nuts and everyone had an opportunity fund, there was so much partner level dialogue about, are we just idiots not to do this?
Right.
And ultimately concluding the same thing over and over again. Like there's a reason we don't do, like we have to start from our mission. But
Yeah.
it's like it doesn't take much, I don't think, to drift away from those things.
Yeah.
And it's constantly in some ways a fight,
Yeah.
right? In that, you look around constantly, you're like, geez, like we do this funny exercise at HBS where the students do it, where they look at our fund one and all the outcomes, and they say, had we done pro rata on everything, what would the outcome have, what would the economics look like?
Yeah.
And it's crazy, right? Like we would have made 20 times or something what we
Right.
made. And I stand, and everyone's like, so then the professor says, well, how many people think they should have done that? It's almost every hand in the class.
Right.
And I stand up and I say, I'm very fond of saying, I don't know if there's anyone who said this before, I probably stole it from somebody, but the only thing you get for free in strategy is wishful thinking.
Right.
Right? Meaning we would have needed $1 billion fund to do all those follow-ons. Well, there were a good number of $1 billion, or maybe $500 million funds
Right.
around at the time. Most of them didn't do particularly well in that period.
Right.
You really think we make these investments, this set of investments, if we're $1 billion fund, or do you think our opportunity set looks way less appealing because we're $1 billion fund?
Yeah.
Right? Like this is all achieved because of the strategy, and the only thing you get for free is this wishful thinking that we could have actually,
Yeah.
written errata checks truly against everything, and it wouldn't have it wouldn't have changed the strategy, wouldn't have changed all the outcomes.
Right.
People wouldn't have invited us into all these opportunities, right?
Right.
If we were very aggressive in that way. So it's like interesting,
Yeah.
but it's like, it's every day we're definitely fighting against the tide. I would say, to be fair, Bryce Roberts fights it more than I do. He's
Yeah.
got a funny thing he says to me, which is, we believe exactly the same thing. You just don't do anything about it, Eric. And I say,
Ouch.
we believe exactly
Ouch.
the same thing. I just navigate it in the real world.
Yeah.
And you have this like complete fantasy notion of what's possible.
Yeah.
And I say, I hope you're more right than I'm right. But I
That's
don't think
fun. Well, it's funny. Jonathan and I make fun all the time of venture capitalists, like math and conclusions and syllogisms. It's the least rigorous mathematics and logic. It's got to be of any sector. And when people start doing these back testing and all these things, you kind of get to conclusions like, well, you should have taken your entire fund and put it in Facebook,
Yeah,
like
of course.
Excel. That would
Yeah.
have been the best strategy.
There's very rarely sort of a true truth accounting of the way people really made decisions. There's
Yeah.
just a lot of narratives.
Right. Well, and you never sit around over a beer and say, for one of your companies that just failed and went out of business, we could have owned 30% of that. And there was a time when I talked to the guy and I sat with Travis, we could have owned, we could have done this and that. You never say that about that company because you're like, glad we never put more money into that. So,
Of course. And I joke about it, but like 20% into everything. Why not 30? Why not 40? And why not
right.
all into your losers? Because it
Yeah.
turns out it's actually very hard to identify your winners. And even if you do, it's very hard to actually maintain your ownership in all of
Yeah.
those companies. So
Exactly.
anyway,
Yeah.
the BS factor's high, unfortunately.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. How do people find you, follow you, or maybe you don't want to be? Well, of course you want to be found, but what's the best way to keep up with you? Is it?
I'm Addy Paley on Twitter. I do blog from time to time, and I'm Eric at Founder Collective, and people are very welcome to reach out. We do try to review every single email we get, so we take that pretty seriously.
All right. Well, thanks so much. This has been the Something About Your podcast. Eric Paley, my guest. Talk to you next time.